Hello everyone! In today's video I will show you the first few steps you need to go through if you have got yourself a new Linux VM. Let's get started. So first thing you need is, if you somehow still don't have it, you need to have a virtual machine. There are several ways you can do this. You can go to one of the major cloud providers, but what I like to use mainly because of the price is Linode. Essentially what it allows me to do is have this very cheap option where essentially you can have, if I just select any kind of region here, you can have something called a Nano, and it costs you really $5 a month. And for this you get like 1 GB of RAM, 1 CPU, 25 gigs of storage. But for your personal projects, that's completely fine. And I really like using it because it kind of forces you to learn all the steps that you need to go through when actually configuring your environment. And then you can deploy, of course, whatever you want. So once again, Linode, if linode.cloud.linode.com, if you still don't have a server. Second thing you need is a terminal. Here in my Visual Studio Code, I'm using the one that comes with Git. So when you install Git, you get this, and then you can attach it to your Visual Studio Code. Or what I would also use very often is a Linux subsystem for Windows. It would also allow me to SSH into a server and then make modifications. So I'm sure there are plenty other options, but these are the two that I used in the past. So first thing we need to do is we need to SSH into a server. And usually all the cloud providers will just give you this command. It's super simple. Essentially you say SSH and then the username that we will be using. By convention, the first user that is created will be called root, and then you have an @ and then an IP address, and then you hit enter. This is the message that you will see the first time you connect, because it's an unknown host. So then you essentially get a message that it was added to a list of known hosts if you said yes, and then you need a root password. This password you should have created when ordering the VM. So at this point, you should know it. Everyone, of course, will have their own different password. And essentially, if you see a message like this, right? So in my case, it's Ubuntu Linux, and this tutorial will be geared the most towards Ubuntu, although on different distros, these commands are very similar. So this is our server. First thing we will do is we will change the host name. So here we can see root at localhost. Essentially, host name is a name of our machine. To do it, you say hostname ctl set-hostname, and now the name that you want. So in my case, it will be Agile Poker, but you set whatever you want. Next thing, we need to add a mapping between our IP address and our host name. So what we say is nano/etc/host. So we'll be modifying the hosts file that is in the etc folder using a text editor that's called Nano. And we have this. What we need to do is, under here, we need our public IP address. This should be provided to you by your cloud provider. So essentially not the cloud provider, but the provider of a virtual machine. And now you say here your host name. Agile Poker, make sure not to do a typo. Ctrl+X in my case, Y to save, file to write, OK. And now we should have our host name set. How we can check it is we just say exit. I have now exited. And once again, if I SSH into my machine, I will now see that it's root at Agile Poker and not root at localhost anymore. Okay, this means we have done it correctly. Next thing we need to do, and it's a very important step, we need to set up a new user. So you don't want to be using this root user. This is a user that can essentially do anything. We can remove all the files, we can completely break the machine. What you want to do is always create a new user. Most likely, if you plan to have a little bit more users, you will have more users. But for now, for us, it's important that you say add user, and now the name of your user. So in my case, it will be Tomek Q. So we can see adding a user, new password. So essentially you need to set a password for your user. Here you can just click OK, that's not important. And Y. And we have created a new user. However, we need to add privileges to the user. In my case, I want this user to have sudo privileges. So I will be able to execute sudo commands. We will get to that a little bit later. So I just say add user, my username, sudo. And so now this user has been added to the sudo group, meaning I will be execute sudo commands. This we will see. Let's exit once again. Let's check if we have successfully created our user. So now if you will be saying SSH, we will not be saying SSH root at a certain IP address, because this will always try to log us in with the root user, but we will be saying our username. So we are saying SSH TomacQ in my case. Of course, in your case, it will be a different username at and then an IP address. Of course, IP address, you also have a different one. And now the password, hopefully you also have a different one. And now we can see our username at our host name. This means it has been a success so far. Okay, next step is the SSH login that we are currently doing. Of course, it works, right? We are logging using the login and password, so the username and password. But this is not very safe, because the password, of course, can be brute forced. We don't want to have this happen. This is why it's an absolute standard to set up something called an SSH key. So I will not now explain how it works. It's very important that it will then only allow you to log into your server from a computer where you have a certain key file saved. So there will be a key file on the server, there will be a key file on your computer, and only the computer that contains the key file on the client side, so meaning the computer that you are using, will be able to log in to the server. So how are we going to do this? Is first off, we will exit. I will clear the screen. And then what we will say is ssh-keygen-b for the size. And then it will say that it's generating public private RSA keeper. This is exactly what we want. I will just leave the default file. You can also add a passphrase, but that's not necessary. And then you have a key here. You have yourself a key. Essentially, now what we need to do is we need to copy the public key to the server. You do it with a very simple command. You just say ssh-copy-id. And now your username at. Now you need your email, your IP address. Sorry, not your email. So essentially you say once again ssh-copy-id TomacQ, so in your case your username at your IP address, and you hit enter. Now we need to, of course, input a password, and number of keys added 1. This is good. Let's see if this has worked indeed. Before we do so, maybe a quick comment on this passphrase here. So I skipped it relatively quickly. And why do you need a passphrase, or why do you not need a passphrase? So essentially, if you enter here a passphrase, then you will have to enter it when you will want to use a key. So this means if somebody gets an access to your computer, they still will not be able to log into your server, because if you don't have a passphrase, then if somebody gets an access to your computer, they will be able to use your private key to connect to your server. It's just a security choice that you have to make on your own. Now let's see if this has worked. So what we will do is I will now SSH into a server, and I should not be asked for a password, and I was not. You can see I just SSH'd into a server and I was not asked for a password. This means our key setup has worked. This also means we can now really work on our security. So what we can edit is, let's go to sudo nano, and now we will be editing some system files. This is why I'm saying sudo nano. So I'll be using the nano text editor, ssh, so /etc/ssh sshd config. And of course, I now need a password. And this file that we have right now open essentially is responsible for all the SSH connections. What I'm looking here for is two things. One, I'm looking for a PermitRootLogin. Yes. Essentially, I want this to know. Why? Because I don't want anyone to be able to access the root user. I don't essentially need it. I now have sudo privileges on my user that we have created, so we don't need to access the root anymore. Nobody needs to access root anymore. And then, second thing I'm looking for is password authentication. And I want to change this to null. So essentially what this means is that every user is forced to log in via an SSH key. And essentially it is no longer possible. So even if someone now knows my password to my user, it will not be possible for them to log in without the key. This is what you want to do, although maybe in bigger organizations this would work a little bit different sometimes. This just depends on the security requirements. However, for me, this would be the default thing that you would do. Essentially, this is how this would be set up. So Control X in my case to save, Y, enter. And then what we should do is we should restart the service. So we are saying sudo systemctl restart SSHD. Now it is very important because now if we messed something up, so for example, if we didn't have the key set up right now, and we changed the setting that we cannot log in with a password, and we hit this, we would not be able to connect to the machine. So this is actually a little bit dangerous if you mess something up. And I forgot that we are on a newer Linux, so no longer SSHD, just SSH. All is good. We are still logged in. This means everything has worked correctly. Let's, just to be sure, let's exit once again. Let's SSH into a server. Once again, we are connected. Everything is working. One last thing before I finish this tutorial, essentially Firewall. So Firewall is a program that is blocking our ports. So ports are these kind of connection gates to your server, right? By default, for example, if you will be serving some websites, you will be doing this on port 80, right? And there are many ports in your server. So what you want to do is block these ports that just there are no connections possible where you do not want them to be possible. So you have several options to do so. What I will show you is now something called UFW, which is an uncomplicated firewall. In my opinion, something that's super simple. You can install it just by saying sudo apt install UFW. Once again, asking me for password. And it's been installed. Our uncomplicated firewall has been installed. What we want to do is now modify it. So I'm saying sudo UFW default allow outgoing. This means that by default everything that is outgoing, meaning from our server outside, will be allowed. And what I want to also do is say sudo UFW default deny incoming, meaning I am rejecting everything that is coming from outside of our server to our server. What I also want to say is sudo UFW allow SSH, because what I now just did is I denied also our SSH request that would come in. So we need to allow SSH requests, otherwise we would not be able to connect to our server. So this is a very important step. And now sudo UFW enable. And it even says to you now that this command might disrupt existing SSH connections. So essentially, if we didn't allow SSH connection, we wouldn't be able to connect anymore. I'm saying yes. And firewall is active and enabled on system startup. This is everything in this tutorial, like all the basic steps I wanted to show you. This is, I think, what is necessary when you set up a new virtual machine, that you are able to work with this virtual machine. This was not very in-depth, this was pretty quick, but this was the point of it, to be very quick in the setup of it. Thank you all for watching. I will leave you a file with all the commands down in the description so that just you can save it for yourself and then use it whenever you set up a new virtual machine. Thank you and see you in the next video.